So when we think about ethical decision making and ethical action, what does it require? At its most basic level, we need to first of all be aware that there's a dilemma. And if we're not aware that there's a dilemma, then it's very difficult for us to say that we're making an ethical decision if we don't really see it as an ethical dilemma. So a lot of training that is being done for ethical decision making and things like that has to do with making people aware of where dilemmas are, what they look like, how it's going to make us feel when we see them, and when we recognize that we've got a tough choice to make based on what we consider to be right or wrong. That's the awareness point. So first of all, we have to be aware. Secondly, we have to be able to reason through ethical issues, meaning that we need to be able to be aware of the different ethical theories. We need to then be able to say, under utilitarianism, I would behave this way, and under universalism, I might behave a different way. Under the justice theories, I might behave a very different way. The goal here is to understand each of the theories and to be able to reason through this. And then next, it's not just about being aware and being able to reason through it. It's ultimately, do you have the motivation to act ethically? If you don't have the motivation to act ethically, there's nothing I can do to train you, to force you to do that. You have to have that motivation. You have to decide that making a good ethical decision matters. And that's not something that I can change for you. That's something that has to come inside of you. And then lastly, you have to have the persistence or the courage or the fortitude, whatever the word is that you want to use, to implement that action even in times of obstacles or pushback, or there could potentially be negative consequences. It is hard to make a decision to be ethical or have the, and even if you're motivated to be ethical, sometimes pulling the trigger and actually doing the right thing can be very challenging. We might lose our job. We might offend people. We might get pushback. We might get harassed for it. And we have to make the decision about, are we willing to make those trade-offs and actually implement the ethical action even when there's pushback. So when our boss tells us, you need to do this, and it's an unethical and illegal thing to do, we need to push back and say, no, I'm not going to do that. So those are the requisite needs for being able to make an ethical decision. And we'll get into much more of that when we get into the next chapter. This discussion then transitions us to this notion of critical thinking. Remember, we said, do we have the ability to reason through things? And that's really what critical thinking is about. Can I reason through things? Am I able to look at a situation, ask pointed questions, figure out how I can better understand what is being said to me, and looking at it with a critical eye. So it is purposeful, reflective judgment that manifests itself in a reasoned consideration. It doesn't say that it has to be rational. It doesn't say that it has to be logical. It just has to be a reasoned consideration, that I'm looking at both sides of an issue. I'm looking at to reason through why someone made a decision, what the assumptions were, why are my assumptions different than yours, and then how do we proceed from there. So it's a reasoned consideration of all the evidence, all the information in front of us, the context that we're in, the standards that we set for ourselves, different methods for critiquing things. We need to be able to do that. And then that, at the end of the day, we have to decide, do I believe this? Do I want to do this, or do I not believe this and not want to do this? So the steps to critical thinking are very similar to the steps to make a good ethical decision or a good decision in general, even if it's not an ethical dilemma. Number one, you have to identify the problem and decide what the priorities are. And when we're thinking about critical thinking, we have to think about what are the variables that matter most with respect to this decision. How is it going to affect stakeholders? How is it going to affect different groups of people? How will it affect the bottom line of the organization? Who is going to agree with it? Who's going to disagree with it? What theory says it's the right approach? What theory says it's the wrong approach? So we have to identify that problem first of all. Then we have to determine what's the relevant information. And there's a lot of bias that can go into deciding what's relevant and what's not. People use their own biased lenses to decide what matters and what doesn't. And when I'm only giving you information that reinforces my idea, and I don't show you information that even challenges my ideas, that can create a problem because now I'm going to be biased and sharing biased data with you. What we want is not just to look for self-confirming evidence. We want to look for disconfirming evidence. We want evidence and information that we're presenting out there that seeks to say our ideas are wrong. I know that feels counterintuitive, but when we're ready to make a tough decision, it's so important for us to look at how we can prove ourselves wrong, because that means then we're being rigorous in the way that we're questioning the ideas, questioning the recommendations, and trying to really work through any potential foreseeable problems that we can address. Then we want to enumerate our options and our consequences. So we figure out what information is relevant. We then figure out what are some of the consequences for each of these assumptions, work through those consequences, because if I make this decision and this is a consequence I don't want to happen, I've got to really make sure I'm clear about what are some of the potential problems that are going to happen when I make this decision. And then once I work through all that, then I can ultimately make the decision, and then I have to evaluate it at the end of the day. So the language is slightly different. They use the acronym of IDEAS. It's a 5-step process, but it really aligns with that circular thing that we saw earlier in this lecture when we talked about identifying the problems, seeking the solutions, generating alternatives, evaluating alternatives. It aligns nicely, except what our focus here is now on is making sure that we are critiquing all those variables very clearly. There are 6 basic critical thinking skills, and they work in a sort of logical, ordered fashion. We have to start with interpretation. What are we interpreting? We have to make sure we have a good analysis, that we are understanding what inferences are being drawn, that we're evaluating, explaining, and then self-regulating. And I'll explain those in the next couple slides so that we understand what those terms mean. When we talk about interpretation, what we're talking about is comprehending and expressing the meaning or significance of a certain experience or situation or the data or the variables in front of us. Whatever it is, it says events, judgments, conventions, etc. So what we're trying to do is to understand. And in order to make sure we understand what somebody's saying, we have to ask those questions. What does that mean? When you use that word, what does it mean to you? And we say, what's happening here? Am I understanding what's happening here, or do you see it and interpret it very differently? So we have to recognize that different sets of eyes are going to interpret a range of variables, a range of things, events, experiences in a very different way. So we want to make sure we're all on the same page. We can't assume if we use the same language that it means the same thing to people. For example, and this is sort of a humorous aside, but I had a boss years ago who was from the United Kingdom, from Great Britain. And he came in one day and he said to me, boy, I was pissed this weekend. And I asked him, I said, who were you mad at? And he turned around and he looked at me and he couldn't understand why I was puzzled and asked that question. And that's because in the King's English, in the UK, when you say that you're pissed, it typically means you got drunk. Versus here in the United States, if I tell you I'm pissed or I was pissed, it means I was mad at somebody. So it's the same word, but it means very different things. And that's what I want to reinforce here when it comes to interpretation. We might be using the same words, but we may not be saying the same thing. Next is analysis, where we identify the intended and actual inferential relationships. If I'm telling you A happens, then B happens, then I'm inferring that A causes B, or that A and B are somehow linked together. So some of the things that we need to ask ourselves when we're doing this is, why do you make this claim? What is the evidence that you have that A happens and then B happens, or that A causes B? What are the conclusions? What is it you're trying to communicate to me in this analysis? So I am going to be looking at the analysis that you did, and I need you to share with me why your analysis proves your point. So it's me critiquing the analysis. Next, we talk about inference and evaluation. So inference is identifying and securing elements needed to draw reasonable conclusions. The hypotheses that we're drawing, the concepts, the ideas, et cetera, et cetera. So the questions that we might ask here is, given what we know so far, what conclusions can we draw? So here's our data, here's the information we have. How can we infer an outcome of some sort based on this data? Are we all on the same page, that we are all coming to the same conclusions, that we're all understanding this in the same way? But if I think there's one conclusion and you think there's a different conclusion to be had, then we need to reconcile that and understand why you and I are coming to different conclusions. What are your assumptions versus my assumptions, and why are they different? So we can also ask things like, given what we know so far, what can we rule out? What does this evidence imply? So we have this evidence. What does it mean? What do we conclude from it? Next is the evaluation, and we already talked about this. It's evaluating the credibility of the sources. And this is where it's important for us to look at, someone says, oh, there are space aliens that live in the sewers. Well, what evidence do we have? Well, I read this thing on this website. Well, is that website reliable? Who's the source of the website? Independent posters of websites and blogs are not always accurate in what they are seeing and what they're communicating. People lie to us all the time. And we look at what happened to Alex Jones and and his conspiracy theories regarding what happened in Sandy Hook. And I can stand up and say this with factual evidence, right? I have friends whose children were affected by this. I have friends who went to that school and friends whose children went to that school. So I know I have firsthand evidence from people that told me, right, what happened at Sandy Hook when the kids were shot at the school. And so when Alex Jones was telling people, oh, no, it's it's fake, it's not real, we have to look at his credibility and recognize it wasn't based on facts. It was all conjecture and guessing, and it wasn't based on anything real. And of course, the courts, found him to be lying and creating a lot of harm to the families who were told basically that their kids were just crisis actors and that they really didn't die at all. And it's just a horrible situation. You can't even imagine to be in there as a parent to have somebody say that to you. So we have to ask how credible the source is, how credible the claim is. Do we trust the person who is making the statement? And if we don't trust them, why don't we trust them? Do we have data that supports it and is contrary to what this other source says? When we've got conflicting sources, we need to then dive in and evaluate the source. If we don't understand the source and evaluate it appropriately, we're going to come up with different conclusions, and no one is going to be able to come up with the right solution. Again, having an opinion is fine, but you have to be able to support those opinions with factual information, with critique and evaluation of those sources to make sure it's valid. The last two include explanation and self-regulation. Explanation is about stating and justifying the reasoning in terms of evidence or concepts, et cetera, et cetera. So when we are questioning the explanation and when we're critiquing the explanation, we're going to ask questions like, what are the specific findings and results of your investigation? So tell me what you found. Tell me what your process looked like. Tell me, how did you go about doing this, and why did you come up with these conclusions? So we're going to critique the analysis, right? And then we're going to critique the conclusions. And so making sure that we understand what people did, why they did it, what was the rationale behind it, making sure we understand all those unspoken assumptions. And then lastly is the self-regulation. It's monitoring and recognizing my own cognitive processes as I might not be communicating clearly. I might be making assumptions, or I might have used a methodology that's not very good. So my self-regulation is about how do I challenge myself when I'm making a decision to make sure I'm making a good decision, that I'm calling in all potential interpretations and as best as I can to make sure that what I'm saying is true and what I'm saying is accurate, and I'm saying that it has evidence that says this matters. Critical thinking has its challenges, of course, and there are a number of different obstacles that have an impact on the ability to make good decisions and to exercise good critical thinking. First of all, fallacious reasoning. For example, making ad hominem attacks on people as opposed to attacking an idea or critiquing an idea. We critique the human who made the idea or brought the idea out. So there's all sorts of fallacious reasoning, which I'll get to in the next page. Then we have bias that happens when we gather data. When we seek information, when we gather data, particularly if we may have a directive decision-making style where we don't necessarily go out and gather a lot of data, we may also be biased in having a self-serving bias or a confirmation bias that we might use as we try to reinforce our ideas but neglect to really look at all sides of a problem and make sure that we are approaching it from a 360-degree situation where we look at all sides of it. We look at and make sure the idea is good or not so good. And we're willing to poke holes in it, as I've said earlier. So we can have bias in gathering the data and what we choose to gather and to look at. We can have bias in the assumptions that we make, which drives how we gather our data. But those baseline assumptions are based on preconceived notions that we have that we're not willing to move away from. And then lastly, bias in the conclusions. We can look at all the data, but I might weight things different than you, so there may be bias in how I choose to understand and interpret the conclusions that I have. All of these things can play an important role in impacting the way we make decisions and the way that we exercise critical thinking. So our goal, of course, is to be, first of all, self-aware. We need to be as self-aware as possible so that we recognize when we've engaged in fallacious reasoning, where we're using inappropriate analogies or we're attacking people and not ideas and all those sorts of things. We should be more mindful as we figure out what our assumptions are. We should make sure that our ideas, our assumptions, the data that we gather, the conclusions that we draw are taking in all sorts of variables, that we're looking for the disconfirming evidence to help us make the best decisions possible. When we can do this, then we can minimize how these obstacles have an impact on our critical thinking. So on this page, there is a lovely list of fallacious reasoning, and very likely those of you that have taken critical thinking in the program at the school here at the university, you've gone through many of these fallacious reasoning biases, but I'm going to just name a couple of them so we have a good sense of things. For example, a straw man. It's where we set up an argument that wasn't really the issue that was being debated, but we throw something out there that biases somebody away from the point they're trying to make. We make it about ourselves instead of making it about the idea. For example, someone says, hey, given these contributions, I think I deserve to share credit with the first author. And so the person's like, well, so fame is more important to you than science? Oh, and it's like, well, no, that's not really what I said. And you can see here in this scenario, the person's response was trying to poke fun at the individual for saying that it was that they wanted to have credit more so than they wanted to have good science, and the argument was not even related to each other. They wanted to have credit for their contributions, and the person was trying to downplay that, kind of gaslighting them in a sense. So again, A straw man is where we throw out an argument that's not really related to what we're talking about, and we make that the point that we're arguing as opposed to the point that the person was originally trying to make, which is, hey, I'd just like to have some credit for this. And the person's like, well, obviously you think more than credit is more important than really good science. They're not related to each other. So another argument is the ad hominem attack, and basically where instead of attacking the idea itself and critiquing the idea, we assume that the individual is the source of the information. We're going to criticize them. So someone says, "Hey, well, I think this is what we should do," and another person responds, "You're closed-minded and stupid. You don't know what you're talking about." And they're not critiquing the idea that the person had, but they're attacking them as a human being. So when someone says something you don't like, you say, "You're stupid, you're mean, you're horrible, I don't like you, you're nasty." We've seen this, and I'm sure we've heard this many times in the news and things like that. An appeal to popularity is where we say, well, everybody's doing it, so we should do it. Well, and that's not always a necessary reason why we should do something, just because you think everybody's doing it, when oftentimes that's not even the case. But basically it means we're claiming something is true just because everybody believes it. So if everybody believed, that there were ghosts on Mars, did that mean it's necessarily true, or are we just on the bandwagon effect, appealing to the popularity that everybody believes it, so it must be true? Other ones. An appeal to tradition is like, well, we've always done it this way, so we should continue to do it this way, and that's not always a good situation. One last one is the false dilemma, where we create a false problem that really didn't exist. For example, when somebody refuses to acknowledge that there's a reasonable position between two extremes, so a person says, well, you're either A or you're B, and that somehow they ignore all the things between A and B. So they're at one extreme or the other, and they assume that there's only these extremes when there's a whole host of things that could happen in between. So basically, if you do this, I'm going to die. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily true. That's an extreme, and that's not necessarily going to happen. So we can see how that would happen. Anyway, many of these things you should know about. You can look them up. They're interesting. They're important that we should know about these as we try to become better critical thinkers. Be aware of them and work hard to practice not using them in our decision process. What are some tools that we can use to improve our critical thinking skills? Well, number one, it's so important anytime someone is sharing information about what they've learned, what they've concluded, how they think about things, ask questions. Always be willing to ask questions. Not in a way to tear somebody down, but as a way to seek to understand something different. For example, what do you already know? How do you know it? What are you trying to prove or disprove or demonstrate? What are you overlooking? What are you assuming? There's all sorts of factors out there. Number two, question your basic assumptions. So ask somebody, so what are your assumptions? You're making an argument about something. What are the assumptions that you're making to make sure I understand your assumptions in context? Be aware where we take our own shortcuts, or we have our own biases, or we engage in what we call the heuristics. When we recognize that we have our own biases and our own Achilles heels and our own triggers, that helps us to be more aware, more mindful, and better able to control our biases, which then would affect our ability to do really good critical thinking. So when we're aware of our weaknesses, when we're aware of the challenges that we have with our critical thinking process, then it makes it better for us. Lastly, when you're thinking about a situation and someone says A causes B or X causes Y, and that doesn't feel right, it's possible that it might be the reverse. It might be that Y causes X. And for an example, this is what we learned a number of years ago in the study of management. We learned a long time ago, or we thought a long time ago, that happy workers were going to be good productive workers. And if they were good productive workers, they would be happier. What we realized now is that productive workers are happy, not happy workers are productive, that it's actually the opposite. For years we went with the assumption of just make your workers happy and they'll be more productive, and then what we realized is if you help them to be more productive, they'll be happier on the job. If you are willing to invest in them, if you're willing to train them, if you're willing to pay them well, and you help them to be good performers, that will make them happy. Lo and behold, all the research in the field then changed based on that, and in a positive way. We started to see more robust findings, and we were able to make better predictions about the types of things that would help people to be better workers. There are also some really important tools that we can use to help us with critical thinking. Number one is to use a checklist. I know that sounds really simplistic, but when we use a checklist, the checklist helps us to free up our frontal cortex, the part of our brain that makes key decisions, and it doesn't overload our brain. When we put things in a checklist, we take it out of our brain doesn't have to remember it anymore. The checklist remembers it for us. When we use those checklists, that frees up our brain to engage in more critical thinking. When we are more mindful, when we are recognized when we are triggered, when we are emotional, when things feel out of control, when we really don't know and we don't understand what's going on around us, being mindful, taking a deep breath, slowing time down for a few moments, being able to just expand our line of vision and to see things with different eyes that we didn't see before. That helps us to be better critical thinkers. And then lastly, brainstorming. Because critical thinking requires us to think in unconventional ways about different options, different ways of focusing on things, different outcomes, different opportunities, different solutions, different alternatives. When we engage in good, unbiased, uncensored brainstorming, that can improve our ability to be better critical thinkers. So a corollary to critical thinking is using that critical thinking to solve problems, to make decisions, to make good ethical decisions. All of these things are entwined. So when we're thinking about using our critical thinking skills and figuring out how do we solve this problem in front of us, first of all, focus on the solution, not the problem. What is it that you would want to see as the end result, and work backwards from there. So when we start with focusing on the solution and not the problem, that helps. So as we're looking at a problem, we say, why did it happen? And then why did that happen? And then why did that happen? And we work our way backstream, asking the question why, till we get to the point where we can't answer the question anymore, where we have found the core issue that has triggered everything else that has moved forward. And then, in order to find the solution, we move forward with how. How do we solve that problem? And then how do we solve that problem? And then how do we solve that problem? And the goal here is, by asking why to go backwards and how to go forwards, it helps us to creatively break down the problem and come up with good solutions. It's also important to recognize, that things are probably more simple than we make them out to be. That often the simplest solution is the reasonable solution. And that's Occam's razor, right? We make things more complex than they need to be, and in fact, it might be that the most simple thing is really the issue. When we are engaged in critical thinking and problem solving, don't censor yourself. List out as many solutions as you can. Work really hard to try to identify even the most silly things, right, that seem unreasonable. Put them down on the list, because even if they may not lead to a good outcome, they might trigger ideas that do. So we want to focus that way. We want to think laterally. And what we mean by that is, if you want to do something different, you cannot keep digging in the same place. You cannot keep doing the same thing over and over again. What you need to do is go to a different place, do something different, think about things in a different way. So think laterally. You don't dig a new hole by staying in the same place. You've got to move to a new location. You've got to do things differently. And then lastly, always think about things in terms of possibility. What if we could do blah, blah, blah? What if this happened? Would that work? What if we could do this? Can we find a way to make it work? Think about it as what is possible, not necessarily of what we've always done, because that's how you're going to be able to creatively solve problems in the long run.